In the winter of 2021, satellite imagery revealed a buildup of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. On the 4th of February, following a meeting between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin during the Winter Olympics opening ceremony, China and Russia published a joint statement which declared that friendship between the two states has no limits, and emphasizing that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. 3 weeks later, Russia launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, thus sparking the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. Not everyone who fought in World War I agreed that it ended in 1919. After the Treaty of Versailles was signed, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied armies Ferdinand Foch reportedly declared, "This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Today, when we consider the events that preceded World War II with the benefit of historical hindsight, I believe there is a strong case to be made that the Second World War was really just a continuation of the first one. And when thinking along those lines, there is a similar case to be made regarding the Cold War. And from that perspective, the greatest trick the communists ever pulled was convincing the West that the Cold War was over." How do you defeat a nuclear-armed adversary? By taking the indirect approach. You isolate them diplomatically by convincing other countries to adopt your political values. This can be done by, for example, funding a political candidate who is sympathetic to your cause. It can also be done by providing arms and munitions to a military officer who's willing to take power through a coup. As you isolate your enemy, you can also weaken them from within by subverting their institutions. Your enemy has a free press? Sponsor the university professors who will eventually educate the next generation of journalists. Your enemy values free speech? Secretly fund your own news agencies to spread your own propaganda. You essentially want to wage psychological warfare against your adversary. Because you can't hope to survive an all-out war, you need to get your opponent to lose their will to fight. You do that by isolating them from their friends, and by sowing the seeds of internal conflict. This, in a nutshell, is how the Cold War was waged. Let's return to the World War I metaphor I used in the intro for a moment. Whether you regard the world wars as the same or as two separate conflicts is essentially a definitional question. Your perspective depends on how you personally define a wide range of concepts. To illustrate what I mean, consider the following question. When does a human life begin? Some people would say life begins at birth, and others would say it begins at conception. In other words, your answer depends on how you define human, life, and begin. And these are, in a sense, semantical arguments. And while I'm pretty decent at making semantical arguments, those are not the kind of arguments I'm going to be making in this video. I'm not going to argue why I believe the Cold War never ended, and I'm not going to be discussing why I think we got here. Instead, I'm going to focus on where I believe we are right now, which essentially is in a Cold War with China. Why do I believe that? Well, for starters, in 2021, countries that suffered democratic declines outnumbered those that improved by more than 2 to 1. Unfortunately, this development is not new. Democratic decline is a trend that has been ongoing for the past 16 years. This decline has impacted virtually every category that one might care to measure. From election integrity to personal autonomy, freedom seems to be in a global recession. This development has led us to a point where nearly twice as many people live in a country ranked not free as those who live in a free one. These findings come from Freedom House's latest Freedom in the World report. According to the report, authoritarian regimes have become more effective at co-opting or circumventing the norms and institutions meant to support basic liberties and at providing aid to others who wish to do the same. The leaders of China, Russia, and other dictatorships have succeeded in shifting global incentives, jeopardizing the consensus that democracy is the only viable path to prosperity and security, while encouraging more authoritarian approaches to governance. So there seems to be a concerted effort amongst authoritarian regimes to actively spread their model, to actively get other countries to adopt their political values and their way of doing things. On top of that, the hypothetical examples for how to defeat a nuclear-armed adversary that I provided earlier were all things that the Soviet Union actually did in order to defeat America. And today, China is doing the exact same things. Spies funding sympathetic politicians, arming military dictators, co-opting university professors, and using Western media outlets to spread their propaganda. The tactics are the same as before. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the situation now is more dire. The CCP has had decades to learn from and improve on the Soviet Union's tactics, and one of the ways in which that experience has manifested itself is through the Three Warfares doctrine. The Three Warfares is the official People's Liberation Army's information warfare doctrine, and it consists of the following: psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. In addition to explicitly making subversion an official part of their military doctrine, the degree to which CCP spies have infiltrated the West is staggering. In December 2020, a database containing the personal information of nearly 2 million CCP party members was leaked. The database revealed that these party members were embedded in sensitive industries such as defense, pharmaceuticals, financial services, foreign consulates, and universities. The database also revealed that 79,000 CCP branches were established worldwide, with some embedded in global corporations. I don't think it's an exaggeration to claim that virtually every level of Western society has been infiltrated by CCP spies. This is a problem because if you spend any amount of time reading CCP publications, they make it explicitly clear that they are at war with the West. They talk incessantly about how to defeat America and about how they plan on upending the established world order. And personally, I'm inclined to take them at their word, because I believe their actions demonstrate that they're being deadly serious. As evidence of that, let's examine China's involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China's role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine starts with this document. This is the joint statement where our two belligerents declared that friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. One such area of cooperation includes: the sides are against addressing international problems indirectly and without consensus, oppose unilateral sanctions, as well as the abuse of export control policies. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the West responded with economic sanctions. Now, if I were Putin, I think it would be reasonable to predict that further conflict in Ukraine would be met with more sanctions. And as Russia was preparing to invade, it appears that Xi and Putin took preemptive steps to mitigate the effects of that response. According to data from the World Bank and China's official customs data, trade between China and Russia grew to almost $147 billion in 2021, which is an increase of almost 36% from the previous year. The two countries were aiming to increase the trade total to $200 billion by 2024, but following the meeting at the Winter Olympics, that target was increased to $250 billion. The meeting also produced Russian oil and gas deals with China worth an estimated $117.5 billion, thereby reducing Russia's dependence on its traditional European energy consumers. Since then, Russia has announced plans to build a new gas pipeline directly to China via Mongolia. And 6 days before the invasion, Russia announced a years-long deal to sell 100 million tons of coal to China. And hours before Russia started bombarding Ukraine, the countries announced that China would begin importing Russian wheat and barley. Okay, so Russia and China trade more. So what? That doesn't necessarily imply that China supports or condones Russia's invasion. Well, this is where things get interesting. 2 days before the invasion, it appears that a member of China's state-run media accidentally published censorship rules for how to cover the conflict. Staff were reportedly instructed to avoid posting any Ukraine-related content on China's Twitter like Weibo that may come across as unfavorable to Russia or pro-Western. The post also instructed journalists to take their cues on which topics to cover from Xinhua News Agency, which is one of the CCP's foremost party mouthpieces. The same day, a senior editor at Xinhua wrote the following on his personal blog. It is in China's interests to support Russia from afar, as Beijing will need Moscow's support when it wants to force its hand on Taiwan independence. On February 25th, we learned that in the months leading up to the war, members of the Biden administration held numerous meetings with top Chinese officials where the Americans shared intelligence indicating a Russian invasion. They reportedly beseeched the Chinese to tell Russia not to invade. In response, the Chinese rebuffed the Americans, saying they did not think an invasion was in the works. After one diplomatic exchange in December, US officials got intelligence showing Beijing had shared the information with Moscow, telling the Russians that the United States was trying to sow discord and that China would not try to impede the Russian plans and actions. Finally, according to a press release from the Russian embassy in China, Putin called Xi on the 25th, one day after the invasion began. During that phone call, the Russian president informed the Chinese president in detail about the decision to carry out special military operations aimed at protecting civilians from genocide, as well as ensuring the demilitarization and denazification of the Ukrainian state. Xi Jinping stressed that he respects the actions taken by the Russian leader in the current crisis situation. The two sides reaffirmed their willingness to further closely coordinate and support each other. They noted that the use of illegal sanctions to achieve self-interested goals of individual countries must never be allowed. In light of this, the leaders of the two countries emphasized the importance of strengthening bilateral pragmatic cooperation, taking into account the results of their talks in Beijing on February 4th. It doesn't get much more explicit than that, folks. Or does it? On March 2nd, the New York Times published the following bombshell. A Western intelligence report said senior Chinese officials told senior Russian officials in early February not to invade Ukraine before the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, according to senior Biden administration officials and a European official. Based on what we've just seen, I believe China knew of the invasion and was essentially prepared to fund Russia's war efforts by purchasing Russian goods. And in return, Russia secures access to consumer goods through trade with the world's largest producer of said goods. At least, that's what I think the plan was initially. As things currently stand, it seems the West's reaction far exceeded their expectations. As far as sanctions go, I'm under the impression that Russia has been hit with the economic equivalent of a nuclear bomb. As reported by the Epoch Times, that includes kicking Russian financial institutions off the SWIFT global payment system, integral for inter-country money transfers, freezing the assets of oligarchs, restricting Russian planes from accessing European, American, and Canadian airspace, and stopping Moscow's central bank from accessing currency reserves overseas. Furthermore, Visa, MasterCard, and American Express announced the suspension of all operations in Russia, which means that Russian civilians will no longer be able to use their cards abroad or for international payments online. And while these sanctions have failed to deter Russia's military operations in Ukraine, they seem to have been successful in preventing Chinese banks and businesses from providing Russia with economic assistance, at least temporarily. Because despite the sanctions, China's foreign minister still maintains that Russia is his country's most important strategic partner, and that Chinese ties with Moscow constitute one of the most crucial bilateral relationships in the world. Now that we've examined China's role in facilitating war in Europe, I'd like to switch gears back to the idea of a Cold War with China. In many ways, I view the Ukraine conflict as analogous to the proxy wars fought between the US and the Soviet Union. The details are, of course, different. Russia, for instance, has their own reasons for invading. But essentially, I view China's backing of Russia as a way for China to increase their global influence while diminishing the West's. And if that interpretation holds any merit, then we might be able to make some predictions about how the future is going to develop. And personally, I feel like these are somewhat safe predictions to make because they merely involve extrapolation based on current events. And so, with that as our baseline, let's return to the joint statement we saw previously. I believe that document highlights some of the fronts on which the new Cold War is already being fought. And where better to start than with nuclear proliferation? The sides believe that all nuclear weapons states should abandon the Cold War mentality and zero-sum games, reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their national security policies, withdraw nuclear weapons deployed abroad, eliminate the unrestricted development of global anti-ballistic missile defense systems, and take effective steps to reduce the risks of nuclear wars and any armed conflict between countries with military nuclear capabilities. On May 27, 2021, Hu Zhijian, editor of CCP mouthpiece The Global Times, published the following opinion piece where he wrote, "We must be prepared for an intense showdown between China and the US. The number of China's nuclear warheads must reach the quantity that makes US elites shiver should they entertain the idea of engaging in a military confrontation with China." On November 3rd the same year, the Pentagon published a report titled Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China. The report states that last year, DoD estimated that the PRC had a nuclear warhead stockpile in the low 200s, and projected it to at least double over the next decade. Since then, Beijing has accelerated its nuclear expansion, which may enable the PRC to have up to 700 deliverable nuclear warheads by 2027, and likely intends to have at least 1,000 warheads by 2030. This buildup comes in a context where China has already threatened to use nuclear weapons against multiple countries. In response to escalating tensions with Japan, the CCP published the following video in July of last year.
我们在解放台湾时，如果日本胆敢武力干预，哪怕出动一兵一卒、一机一舰作战力量，我们不是对等还击，而是对日本全面开战，首战用核弹，连续用核弹，直到日本第二次宣布无条件投降。
In September, after Australia announced the purchase of nuclear-powered submarines, note, nuclear-powered, not armed, our favorite mouthpiece, The Global Times, published an article which declared Chinese military experts warned that such a move would potentially make Australia a target of a nuclear strike if a nuclear war breaks out, even when Washington said it won't arm Canberra with nuclear weapons. In February of this year, Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, while speaking to a television audience, said that in light of the invasion of Ukraine, which has no nuclear weapons, Japan should discuss if the idea of sharing nuclear weapons with allies by letting them base some of their weapons on Japanese soil. NATO has a similar arrangement in Europe in which the United States maintains some nuclear weapons on the territory of its allies. And when Japan has started considering hosting nuclear warheads, that's when you know that shit's getting serious. Later the same month, Belarus amended its constitution to renounce its non-nuclear status. Following the referendum, Belarus's President Lukashenko announced, "If you, the West, transfer nuclear weapons to Poland or Lithuania, to our borders, then I will turn to Putin to return the nuclear weapons that I gave away without any conditions." In short,
Looks like
Nukes.
back on the
Geopolitical.
menu, boys.
I believe the situation can best be summarized by Admiral Charles Richard, head of U.S. Strategic Command. And this is what he had to say during a congressional hearing on March 8th.
Chairman Milley rightly stated, we are witnessing one of the largest shifts in global geostrategic power the world has ever witnessed. Today, we face two nuclear-capable near peers who have the capability to unilaterally escalate to any level of violence in any domain worldwide with any instrument of national power at any time, and we have never faced a situation before like that in our history.
The sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches. Another classical hallmark of the Cold War was mutual defense treaties and military blocs. Those two are making a resurgence. NATO, of course, is playing the prominent role in regards to Russia's invasion. However, assuming the war in Ukraine does not escalate to a general war in Europe, I believe other military blocs will take center stage in the coming years. If China is indeed the main antagonist, the European front will secede its primacy to the Indo-Pacific. This belief is shaped in part by a 2022 publication titled Indo-Pacific Strategy of the United States. It states that our considerable strategic ambitions derive from the belief that no region will be of more consequence to the world and to everyday Americans than the Indo-Pacific. As to why this region is so consequential, this intensifying American focus is due in part to the fact that the Indo-Pacific faces mounting challenges, particularly from the PRC. The PRC is combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological might as it pursues a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and seeks to become the world's most influential power. The PRC's coercion and aggression spans the globe, but it is most acute in the Indo-Pacific. From the economic coercion of Australia, to the conflict along the line of actual control with India, to the growing pressure on Taiwan and bullying of neighbors in the East and South China Seas, our allies and partners in the region bear much of the cost of the PRC's harmful behavior. In the process, the PRC is also undermining human rights and international law, including freedom of navigation, as well as other principles that have brought stability and prosperity to the Indo-Pacific. Enter AUKUS and the Quad. AUKUS is a trilateral security pact between Australia, the UK, and the US. Its formation in 2021 was at least in part a reaction to China's expansion of military operations in the Indo-Pacific. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, is essentially a diplomatic and military arrangement between Australia, India, Japan, and the US, and it was initiated for many of the same reasons as AUKUS. China has condemned the Quad as an attempt by Washington to create an Asian NATO to suppress Beijing's rise. For their part, China and Russia stand against the formation of closed bloc structures and opposing camps in the Asia-Pacific region, and remain highly vigilant about the negative impact of the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy on peace and stability in the region. What I believe we're witnessing here is the same process that eventually gave birth to NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And while AUKUS and the Quad are not explicitly mutual defense treaties, I believe they will develop in a way that serves a similar function. I also believe the cooperation between China and Russia will develop in a similar manner. And regardless of the details, I believe that, as tension continues to escalate, more countries will be drawn in and will be forced to pick a side. And eventually something resembling a new Iron Curtain might develop, and at that point, who knows what might happen. The sides are ready to strengthen dialogue between partners and coordinate positions on trade and economic issues of common concern. contribute to ensuring the sustainable and stable operation of global and regional value chains, promote a more open, inclusive, transparent, non-discriminatory system of international trade and economic rules. The US dollar dominates global trade. In 2019, roughly 88% of international transactions involved US dollars. No other currencies came close. This gives the US extraordinary power over nearly anyone who imports or exports anything, anywhere. And here's how that system works.
A Canadian lumber company sells boards to a French home builder. The buyer's bank in France and the seller's bank in Canada settle the payment in dollars via correspondent banks in the United States. These correspondent banks have accounts at the United States Federal Reserve. The money is transferred seamlessly between these banks' Fed accounts because their status as correspondent banks means they are seen as safe counterparties. The United States says the use of these correspondent banks means every transaction technically touches US soil, giving it legal jurisdiction and compelling foreign countries to abide by its laws on money laundering and corruption.
As I understand it, the dollar's primacy in international trade is one of the factors that makes it a global reserve currency. The other major contributing factor is the fact that all international transactions involving oil are denominated exclusively in US dollars. I believe that arrangement is what the term petrodollar refers to. Basically, this means that the US has full control over any transaction involving the world's most essential commodity. This is what makes US sanctions so effective. And so long as the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and so long as the petrodollar retains its monopoly, the US will likely remain the world's economic top dog. And as such, any country seeking to upstage the US's position will need to upend that system. And that's exactly what it seems like China and Russia are trying to do. Keep in mind that while inclusive and non-discriminatory economic rules sound nice, those qualifiers are likely a reference to, amongst other things, sanctions imposed by the US on Chinese officials for their involvement in the Uyghur genocide and the brutal takeover of Hong Kong. To become the dominant superpower, China needs the ability to safeguard its economy from that kind of leverage. And while that's a goal they've been pursuing for a while now, their efforts seem to have been kicked up a notch following the Russian invasion. To name just a few examples, some Russian businesses have started accepting payments in yuan. Russia's central bank is looking to replace MasterCard and Visa with China's state-owned UnionPay, and CIPS, China's version of SWIFT, is gaining prominence. The point here is that China is actively pushing the yuan as an alternative to the US dollar as a medium for international trade. And if they are successful, then the US will lose one of its primary tools for influencing CCP officials. Another consequence might be the further solidification of the blocks that I talked about in the previous segment. Deciding to adopt the yuan in favor of the dollar will likely be a signal of which power block the country in question has decided to align with. And this, of course, is the whole goal in a Cold War-style conflict: to bring countries into your sphere of influence. And speaking of spheres of influence, after deciding to ban imports of Russian oil, the Biden administration reached out to Saudi Arabia to get them to pump more oil. Biden's phone calls were promptly ignored. A week later, we learned that Saudi Arabia is in active talks with Beijing to price some of its oil sales to China in yuan, a move that would dent the US dollar's dominance of the global petroleum market and mark another shift by the world's top crude exporter towards Asia. The final update on this front I'd like to mention is Russia's decision to make unfriendly countries pay for Russian gas in rubles. Again, this is the sort of thing I'd expect to see more of in the future as both China and Russia look for new ways to weaken the dollar's prominence. The Russian side reaffirms its support for the One China principle, confirms that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and opposes any form of independence of Taiwan. I believe Taiwan represents the flashpoint most likely to launch the world into World War III. A summary of the situation goes something like this. Taiwan is a self-governed nation with a democratically elected government. The CCP maintains that the island is a Chinese province and has vowed to reunite the island with the mainland, by force if necessary. Given the generally negative view most Taiwanese citizens have of China's government, I believe it's only a matter of time before that force manifests itself through a Chinese invasion. China's favorite way of flexing on Taiwan is by sending military aircraft into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. An ADIZ is airspace that, if you enter, then you need to identify yourself, otherwise the country in question will assume that you are coming to attack. Each time China does this, Taiwan is forced to deploy their own aircraft in response. Given that Taiwan's military is significantly smaller than China's, these operations represent a significant cost for Taiwan. In 2020, the associated monetary costs of such responses accounted for nearly 9% of Taiwan's entire annual military budget. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion, Taiwan's president Tsai Ing-wen has ramped up Taiwan's combat readiness. This is being done by increasing Taiwan's missile and drone production, holding live fire drills, and potentially increasing the duration of Taiwan's mandatory military service. These preparations come at a time when both China and the US have held naval military drills around Taiwan. The most recent sign of increased tensions came on March 18th. Hours before President Biden was scheduled to talk with Xi Jinping about the situation in Ukraine, a Chinese aircraft carrier sailed through the sensitive Taiwan Strait. This leads us to the following question. Why is Taiwan so important? If the largest war in Europe since World War II doesn't escalate into World War III, why do I fear that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will? The answer to that question comes in several parts, the first of which involves microchips and semiconductors. Microchips are to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th. Virtually every modern product with built-in electronics requires them to operate. That includes cell phones, computers, cars, airplanes, cameras, pacemakers, ATMs, robots, rockets, and much, much more. The main producers of these chips are semiconductor companies, and when it comes to semiconductors, Taiwan is top dog. According to research from the Taipei-based research firm TrendForce, Taiwan's semiconductor industry accounted for 63% of the world's total production in 2020. And while that number is impressive, it actually underscores Taiwan's market dominance for the simple reason that not all chips are created equal. According to the research firm Capital Economics, TSMC, which is Taiwan's largest semiconductor manufacturer, has technology so advanced that it now makes around 92% of the world's most sophisticated chips, which have transistors that are less than 1,000th the width of a human hair. Samsung Electronics Co. makes the rest. This means that in addition to producing the lion's share of the world's microchips, Taiwan also has a near monopoly on the production of the most advanced versions in the world. And that fact becomes all the more relevant when we consider that while these chips are used in countless consumer products, their use is essential for military technologies as well. They are in fact so essential that the bipartisan National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence wrote the following in a report delivered to Congress in 2021. If a potential adversary bests the United States in semiconductors over the long term or suddenly cuts off US access to cutting-edge chips entirely, it could gain the upper hand in every domain of warfare. I'm under the impression that it's difficult to overstate how disastrous it would be if China invaded Taiwan and successfully took over their semiconductor production. It seems to me that the advantage they would gain by doing so is comparable to the position the United States was in when they were the only country that possessed nuclear warheads. Another factor contributing to Taiwan's importance is its geographical location. This chain of archipelagos is known as the First Island Chain. In a hypothetical war with the US, this chain forms a barrier that blocks China's access to the Pacific Ocean. That access is important because the waters surrounding China's coasts are not deep enough to hide Chinese submarines from detection. If, however, China was to take Taiwan and thus gain unfettered access to the Pacific, then their nuclear-armed submarines would potentially be able to launch their payloads while remaining undetected. And that possibility is obviously something the Americans would be very interested in avoiding. The third major reason for why a Chinese invasion of Taiwan might potentially be more consequential than Russia's invasion of Ukraine is because, unlike Taiwan, the US actually has a formal defense treaty with Taiwan. In 1979, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. This law states that the United States shall provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character and shall maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion. Declares that in furtherance of the principle of maintaining peace and stability in the Western Pacific area, the United States shall make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capacity. In a Cold War setting, you have two major powers vying to expand their sphere of influence at the expense of the others. And China is currently engaged in border disputes with virtually every neighboring country, including Japan, India, and the Philippines. The only hope these countries have of resisting Chinese aggression is with US assistance. That means there would likely be massive geopolitical shifts if the US failed to respond militarily to a Chinese invasion of a treaty-bound ally. I believe it would signal the end of the US's dominance as the leading superpower, and that other countries better fall in line with China's agenda. In today's video, we've examined what I believe will be the most consequential arenas in the conflicts to come. The contours of the new Cold War, if you will. However, there are currently many smaller battles being waged. I initially planned on including them as the final segment in this video, but I decided against it because of how long this video has gotten already. So instead, I decided to split them into 2 separate episodes, and I'm planning on publishing the second one next week, so be sure to tune in again for that. And if you've gotten this far, then I thank you for watching. If you found this presentation informative or valuable in any way, then why not leave a like down below to show your appreciation. And finally, if you're a regular viewer of my content, then I apologize for how long this video has taken me to produce. I've been sick twice in the past month, and one of those times was with COVID, so I've been out of it for a while. But I seem to be doing better now, and so I fully intend on resuming regular productions. And so, with that, as always, get after it and stay free.